So welcome everybody to the third and last day of our second Food and Communication, or better to say, biannual conference on food and communication. I hope you had a nice time yesterday and the day before. And today we actually are now starting a very interesting session or panel that will be moderated by Alana Mann, and the talk will be given by Priscilla Claeys. I would like now to give the floor to Alana Mann for a short introduction of Priscilla, and then the floor goes to Priscilla with her talk. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrea, and hello to everybody. I'm sure that everyone would agree that this has been a wonderful conference so far, and a real standout, I think, has been the keynote speakers, and today is going to be no exception. Pardon me for saying tonight, I'm dialing in from Sydney. But it is my absolute pleasure to introduce today's plenary speaker, someone who I know very well for her work in the food sovereignty movement, and for whom I have a lot of respect, and whose latest book I actually have on my desk. But let me introduce Priscilla Claeys, who is the Associate Professor in Food Sovereignty, Human Rights and Resilience at the Centre for Agroecology, Water and Resilience at Coventry University in the UK. Priscilla worked for many years, from 2008 to 2014, with the former UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food, Olivier de Schutter. And her work is absolutely essential in the areas of the right to food and food sovereignty, agrarian movements, global food governance and human rights, understanding processes of legal mobilisation, and the way that social movements manage up and advance their claims. She's also a passionate advocate for food security governance, feminism and gender equality, and is looking to help us, I guess, let us enable movements really to lead the way in encouraging inclusion and diversity in policy-making spaces, which is so important and very difficult. And I'm looking really forward to hearing her analysis of that today. The book I referred to before, which has kind of become my Bible, is the Human Rights and the Food Sovereignty Movement, Reclaiming Control, published in 2015 by Routledge, a truly amazing analysis of La Via Campesina, The Peasant Way. She's also co-edited two other books, and her work is appearing in journals including the Journal of Peasant Studies, Sociology and Globalizations. And she's on the board of one of the best organizations, and in fact, I think maybe still the only human rights NGO dealing with the right to food. We might hear more about that, but that's FIAN International, a truly fantastic organization. So tonight, Priscilla is going to talk about redefining human rights from below, peasant movements and the recognition of new rights. So please join me in welcoming her to the floor.
Thank you so much, Alana. I don't think I've ever received such a great personal introduction. It means a lot. So thank you so much. So good morning, everyone. And thank you so much for joining us this morning. I'm really happy to be here today and to have this opportunity to share some of the issues, as Alana said, that I feel so passionate about. I'd like to start by thanking Professor Andrew Calabresi, who invited me here, as well as Andrea for all the work she's done facilitating my participation. Before we start, I want to invite you all to sit comfortably. It's been a long 3-day conference. Make sure you have a glass of water, a nice cup of tea or coffee, that you're sitting comfortably. Maybe you can stretch a bit, make sure you're feeling warm, not too cold, not too warm, so that we can really spend a nice, relaxing hour and a half together. So I'll share my screen. Hopefully we can then all see my PowerPoint. Here we go. Okay, can somebody confirm that you can see it all right?
Everything all right?
Okay, fantastic. So as Alana mentioned, the title of my talk is The Creation of New Human Rights from Below, or by Transnational Peasant Movements. But I want to start with a small introduction connecting my talk to what's happening in the world right now. So discourses on the future of food are everywhere. And next week, the UN is holding its Food System Summit. The objective of the summit, I quote, is to transform the way the world produces, consumes, and thinks about food. The summit claims it will deliver game-changing solutions to promote healthier and more sustainable food systems. Yet many questions have been asked about the summit. Why do private foundations have so much influence? Why are human rights not central to the debates? Are the proposed solutions really transformative? Or do they actually promote industrial agriculture and big data? Who is really participating in the dialogues leading to the summit? In my view, 4 questions are at the heart of debates on the future of food, and actually also at the heart of why the summit has been so contested. And I will unpack these 4 questions in my talk. The first one is, do peasants matter to the future of food? The second one is, do human rights matter to the future of food? And I will add, do women and gender dynamics matter to the future of food? And because, as Alana mentioned, I'm a scholar activist, I will touch on the 4th issue, which is, do academics matter to the future of food? So I'll divide my talk in 4 parts, and at the beginning of each of these parts, I'll ask you to come in with some reflections, thoughts about these general questions that I'll be asking. So I'll ask you to write these answers in the chat, and I'll ask you to post your answers all at the same time. So I'll give you 2-3 minutes to think about it, write it up, and then when I'll say go, everyone will post their answers in the chat, and that will give you a sense of what everyone else is thinking in the room. Okay, so let's get started with our first question. Do peasants matter to the future of food? And I'll invite you to think about that. If you think about peasants, what images come to your mind? What do you see as the role or the future of peasants? And I'll give you a few minutes to reflect. And then when I'll say go, I'll ask you to post your answers in the chat. I'm not sure if I can see the screen and the chat at the same time. Okay, now I can see the screen. Okay, I'll just leave you a few minutes. Okay, so the question is just, what comes to your mind when you think peasants or the peasantry or the role of peasants for the future of our food systems? Okay, I think everyone's ready. So please, when I say go now, paste your answers in the chat. And I'll try and, they matter, they have little power. They should play a big role in sustainable farming. They feed the world. Terrible working conditions. With food, it makes me think of stripping things back. They're fundamental. We should buy food directly from them. Okay, amazing. So I see there's great awareness in the room about the fundamental role that they play. That's fantastic. Okay, so for some people, peasants are a thing of the past. We see them in paintings, in museums, like in this famous painting by Bruegel called The Peasant Dance. For others, peasants are disappearing or aging or both. This is actually from a newspaper celebrating the last Bouvier of France. Peasants are part of our childhood memories of going to the farm, getting some fresh, warm milk. And we vaguely have a sense of how they contributed to shaping the landscapes we enjoy going to for recreation or tourism. Alternatively, peasants are associated with the global south, with poor or so-called developing countries. They're seen as backwards, risk-averse, illiterate, or against innovations. They're doomed to modernize or adapt. Otherwise, they'll have to leave the land and migrate to the cities. In the field of agrarian studies, some even argue that there are no more peasants on the planet. Capitalism has penetrated food systems everywhere, and peasants can no longer exist as autonomous entities outside of the monetized economy. In many parts of the world, peasant is a pejorative term. It's almost an insult. Yet I argue that peasants are alive and strong. And what defines them today, more than their relationship to the land, maybe, more than their reliance on family labor, more than their autonomy or emphasis on subsistence, is a shared political identity. Peasants are organizing, they're joining forces, they're reinventing themselves, they're exchanging sustainable and resilient farming practices, they're promoting agroecology. I'm not here to sell you peasant farming as the next best occupation. Farming is incredibly difficult. It is hard on the body. It is stressful. It doesn't pay well. In Europe, peasants are disappearing at a fast rate. The EU has lost a third of its small farms between 2003 and 2013, while land is increasingly concentrated in the hands of a few. But peasants have organized across the globe in what is today the largest and most dynamic social movement in the world, La Via Campesina, the peasant way, as Alana mentioned. They are a political force, and they are calling for an alternative model, food sovereignty. Via Campesina is a transnational agrarian movement. Transnational means it has organized across over 70 countries. Agrarian means that it brings together people of the land, not only peasants and small-scale farmers, but also agricultural workers, indigenous peoples working the land, pastoralists, nomadic people, herders. La Via Campesina is a social movement because it uses repertoires of action that includes protest, mobilization, going out in the street, but also advocacy and policy dialogue. And in addition, it is also practically involved in promoting sustainable farming practices, building local food systems like community-supported agriculture. Today, La Via Campesina represents 200 million peasants worldwide. And on this map, you can see the presence of farmers' organizations that are members of La Via Campesina across the globe. And over the last 15 years, I have done research and developed collaborations with La Via Campesina at different levels. During my PhD, I was lucky enough, in the period ranging from 2008 to 2013, to conduct fieldwork in 13 different countries. I did this, as Alana mentioned, while working for the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food, Olivier de Schutter. Olivier started this mandate in the midst of the global food crisis. And this really brought some intense discussions and provided amazing opportunities for us to influence discussions. During my PhD, I spent a lot of time in UN arenas like the FAO or the Committee on World Food Security, which was reformed right after the food crisis. In these arenas, peasant organizations like Via Campesina had managed to get their voices heard and influence debates. Personally, I was fascinated by this diverse movement. La Via Campesina is a huge network of people with different ideologies, political stances, languages, cultures, religions, but also strategies. Yet the movement had managed to articulate shared demands. It had succeeded in framing a shared vision of the alternative model it was defending, food sovereignty. What triggered my interest even more was to discover that the movement had adopted human rights to frame its demands. The peasant life, the peasant way of living was under attack. Neoliberalism, trade liberalization, structural adjustment programs, modernization, all these things were dispossessing peasants of their lands, their seeds, their means of subsistence. And as they were being evicted and made redundant, their voices grew stronger and stronger to demand the right to land, the right to seeds, the right to produce, or simply, as one of them put it to me, the right to exist. My research back then, my research question was very simple. I would go around and ask peasants, what is food sovereignty to you? Why do you say that food sovereignty is a right of the people? And this turned out to be a very productive and complex question, which kept me busy for at least 5 years, and on which I continue to reflect today. So now we're entering the second part of this talk with another question. Do human rights matter, or how do they matter, and why do they matter to the future of food? And I'll again ask you to stop here and reflect and post some of your answers or impressions in the chat. And while you do this, I'll take some water. Okay, while you do this, I'm reading some more responses in the chat and just feel like I need to respond to one of the comments about peasants producing less quantitatively, but more qualitatively. And I want to emphasize that we often have this impression that most of the food produced in the world goes through big companies, food processors, distributors, but actually 70% of the food that is produced globally is produced by peasants. And the way we produce the way we measure productivity also needs to be revised to take account of all the various dimensions of production on a piece of land. But that's maybe a topic we can discuss and get back to in the Q&A. So if you're ready to post your answers on the role of human rights, or what comes to your mind when you think human rights, please post them now in the chat. Okay, so I'm reading some of the answers. The strength of international human rights frameworks, that's great, which has limitations too, as human rights are not enforced. Human rights are central to the future of food, but likely not compatible with the industrial agricultural complex, indeed. I see a lot of reference to the right to food, so that's great. I see this audience is already well familiar with this important right. Social inequalities, more and more a matter of negotiation as rural areas become more diverse. Wow, great responses. Clearly a threat to corporations. Are human rights a threat to corporations, or are corporations a threat to human rights? I don't know. Okay, well, great. Great job. I'll just go back to screen sharing. Okay. So the way I see it, human rights are a key resistance tool. Framing claims in human rights terms is increasingly popular with social movements around the globe. And I see a number of reasons for this. Human rights, as some of you mentioned, are universal. They create unity and they provide a reference frame for diverse groups. Human rights also bring legitimacy and attention to a cause. There's a sense of urgency with human rights. And also, as one of you mentioned, human rights come with monitoring and reporting mechanisms. So they provide a channel through which one can process demands, even though human rights are technical, bureaucratic, not easy to access, and not always effective. I was quite familiar with human rights before starting my PhD. I considered myself a human rights activist. In 2003, and you can see here an old picture of me and some colleagues, I joined FIAN International, the main organization promoting and defending the right to food. I was active in the national section of FIAN Belgium. This is where I come from. In the following years, I participated in what we called fact-finding missions in different countries, like Brazil or the Philippines. Fact-finding missions bring together a team of international lawyers or human rights activists who document and uncover violations of the right to food to call international attention. Through FIAN, I discovered that many rural communities around the world were being evicted from their land, either by the state or by private actors. Often they had nowhere to go, no compensation, no recourse mechanism, and they were evicted in very violent ways. I found the right to food very convincing. The right to food is recognized in the UN Declaration of Human Rights of 1948 and in the International Convention for Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. It basically means that nobody should go hungry, that everyone is entitled enough food to live a dignified life and should get access to culturally appropriate, fresh, healthy, sustainable foods. Thanks to the Right to Food campaign in India, as we see in this picture, massive school feeding programs have been deployed, as children are now entitled one free meal every day to ensure they don't go hungry. And this has been an amazing program, also encouraging parents to send their children to school. Current estimates indicate that nearly 690 million people are hungry, or 8.9% of the world population. The number of people affected by hunger globally has not decreased as we progress to corporate food systems. Rather, it has been on the rise since 2014. If we include people affected by moderate or several severe levels of food insecurity, an estimated 2 billion people did not have regular access to food in 2019. The world is not on track to achieve zero hunger by 2030. If recent trends continue, nearly 10% of the population will be hungry 10 years from now. And this scenario doesn't even account for the potential impacts of COVID-19. Hunger is not caused by extreme weather events or calamities, as Amartya Sen demonstrated. It is caused by social injustice and inequality. And the right to food is a very powerful tool to analyze food systems and identify the structural issues that are causing hunger and food insecurity. Yet, and this was the paradox, I came to realize, talking to food sovereignty activists, that their ambition went far beyond the right to food, even though peasants and rural people are the most affected by hunger. As I document in this book that came out of my PhD research, human rights and the food sovereignty movement reclaiming control, La Via Campesina had a different agenda. It was not to demand the realization of the right to food, at least not only. It was to reinvent human rights from below. And that is how I started following the emergence of the rights of peasants. I might as well tell you right away that this is an amazing success story, one that is cherished by peasant movements as a victory. After 17 years of struggle, peasants succeeded in getting the UN General Assembly to adopt a new international legal instrument recognizing new human rights for rural people. This instrument is called the UNDRAP, UN Declaration on the Rights of Peasants and Other People Working in Rural Areas. It was adopted in 2018, almost 3 years ago. And it was negotiated, and this is quite unique in the history of the Human Rights Council, on the basis of a draft declaration that was elaborated by La Via Campesina itself. For 5 years, I interviewed the peasants active in the negotiation process at the UN, but I also actively followed the sessions of the Intergovernmental Working Group in charge of elaborating the UNDRAP. And this is what my fieldwork looked like. I spent a lot of time in this dark room, full of diplomats, men in suits, but also at the small cafe where peasants and their allies were strategizing over coffee. Before going more into this process, I want to share 3 reasons to celebrate the UNDRAP. First, it recognizes new human rights to land, seeds, and food sovereignty. These rights are now recognized by the UN as standalone human rights. And I say this because part of these rights were, of course, implicitly recognized as components of the right to food, for example. But now they receive visibility and recognition as standalone human rights. As we saw in the first part, the term peasants continues to be seen as pejorative. And that is why I think that UNDRAP is super important as well, because it recognizes the peasantry as political and legal subjects. And in fact, during the negotiations, many diplomats and states were opposed to using the term peasant. They didn't want to use it in the title. They didn't even want to talk about it. And I think this is changing now that the UNDRAP has given them that legitimacy. In my opinion, the UNDRAP is promoting a recognition of peasants as modern and active actors who hold knowledge, who hold solutions, and who are key to food system transition. For example, peasants are increasingly vocal in discussions around climate change, and they're promoting peasant agriculture as a tool that can help cool the planet. Finally, the UNDRAP is a legitimate new international legal instrument because of the way it was negotiated and because it was elaborated from the bottom up. As Mark Edelman and myself have argued in an article published in the Journal of Peasant Studies, UNDRAP is a case of vernacularization in reverse. This sounds very complicated, but it isn't. So what does it mean? The famous legal anthropologist Sally Engel-Mary has developed the concept of vernacularization to analyze the process by which global ideas like human rights get appropriated and translated in local contexts. For example, ideas around gender equality and women's rights are used in a variety of ways by different actors locally to advance their agenda. As these actors use human rights, meanings of women's rights evolve, get contested, and they vary based on the place in which they're deployed. The key idea here is that human rights are not static. They're socially constructed by the people who claim them. So that is the concept of vernacularization. What we observed with the UNDRAP was a reverse process. La Via Campesina activists did not translate or adapt the right to food to local context. Rather, they sought to create framings of human rights that reflected their worldviews, that were useful in their struggles. They engaged in the creation of new rights, and in the process, they became makers of law. And this is a very important aspect to consider, as human rights are often seen as the exclusive domain of lawyers, not of the people. And I argue with others that human rights can only be relevant if they're conceptualized by the marginalized, by the oppressed, who need them as a resistance tool. As Boaventura de Sousa Santos has documented, a growing number of social movements are contributing to changing human rights, to the emergence of alternative conceptions of human rights. Historically, human rights are associated with the Enlightenment era, with the individual, with the West. But today's social movements are pushing for conceptualizations of human rights that are less colonial, less Western, less individualizing. They are demanding and pushing for conceptions of rights that are more multicultural. And as we will see with the UNDROP, the fact that peasants claimed the right to land as a collective right, for example, and not an individual right, is very indicative of this trend. Before I continue, I want to pause here because you might wonder, what are new human rights? When do you decide that a right is new? Basically, new rights are rights that are not recognized in international law. The right to land, as I just mentioned, is one of these new rights. And in the last decades, a number of groups have succeeded in getting their rights recognized. The case of indigenous peoples, of course, comes to mind. The right to water has been recognized as a new human right. But I am also thinking of the rights of people with handicap, for example. But many groups have also failed or not succeeded, because achieving international recognition is not easy. In this important work, Clifford Bob has developed a framework to analyze the creation of new human rights from below. And he discusses 4 steps in this process, which I will apply to the UNDROP, not to explore them in any detail, but just to highlight key lessons learned at each moment. These 4 steps are framing, and this topic will be familiar for you working on food and communication, connecting to human rights NGOs and experts, convincing states, and implementing the rights contained in the declaration. Before I do this, I will suggest a small video break. So this is a video that was produced by FIAN International during the negotiations process to, I'm trying to stop sharing my screen, to basically explain what the whole process was about, the main arguments in favor of the declaration, but also try and highlight the main issues that the declaration was supposed to address. So I'll ask now my great assistant with communications to share this video, and I hope you enjoy it. And we'll give you
Today, 70% of the food produced globally comes from what is called peasant farming. They are fishing and herding communities, peasants, pastoralists, nomadic peoples, landless peasants, indigenous peoples, or rural workers. Thanks to them, we eat sustainable and quality food. It is generally opposed to what is called industrial farming, which only produces to make profit, with huge costs for society and the environment. Although growing numbers of people have been denouncing the appalling impact of that type of farming, public policies still favor the agro-industrial model at the expense of the agro-ecological model. As a consequence, peasants are systematically marginalized and discriminated against and are the first victims of hunger. Out of nearly 1 billion people suffering from hunger in the world, 80% live in rural areas. and the current existing instruments are not enough to protect them. Therefore, different actors have come together to draw a unique declaration on the rights of peasant women and men and other people working in rural areas. On the one hand, peasants, civil society, and Via Campesina, the largest international movement of peasants, they have been working since 2001 on the draft declaration. On the other hand, the United Nations, and therefore our governments. After the food crisis in 2008, the UN Human Rights Council mandated the Advisory Committee to make recommendations to better protect the rights of people working in rural areas. The committee's conclusion is crystal clear. They need a specific protection. Building largely on the declaration of Via Campesina, the committee proposes to adopt a declaration on the rights of peasants and other people working in rural areas. It is this very declaration that is currently being negotiated.
Los campesinos y las campesinas son las personas que alimentan nuestro mundo, que mantienen el medio ambiente funcionando bien, y cada día en nuestro trabajo en FIAN observamos que son víctimas de violaciones, que son impactados por violaciones de sus derechos humanos, no solamente del derecho a la alimentación, pero también criminalizados, de su derecho a la salud, de su derecho a un medio ambiente sano. Por ejemplo, un campesino sin tierra o un campesino sin semillas no es más un campesino. Y por esto necesitamos que esos derechos inherentes a los campesinos sean reconocidos a nivel internacional.
Avec ce qu'on appelle le phénomène de la mondialisation, les paysans ont perdu tout contrôle sur le processus à la fois de production et de la commercialisation de leurs produits. Mais aussi, il y a des accaparements de terres maintenant, et monoculture, agrocarburants, etc., qui font que les paysans sont soumis à des grandes pressions et sont forcés à quitter les campagnes.
Wir steuern mit der momentanen Agrarpolitik in die völlig falsche Richtung. Wir brauchen eine sozial gerechte Landwirtschaft. Wir brauchen sehr, sehr viele kleine Betriebe, die nachhaltig produzieren. Und das ist in der Ernährungssouveränität alles festgeschrieben. Und es geht wirklich darum, diese Forderungen heute, jetzt, sofort umzusetzen, um zu verhindern, dass noch größere ökologische und soziale Schäden entstehen.
On a des problèmes de différents types, que ce soit d'abord un droit à la santé, à l'environnement sain, qui est souvent bafoué tant au nord qu'au sud avec l'exposition à des pesticides. Un autre sujet important, c'est les semences et le droit à développer et à faire circuler des semences qui soient adaptées et qu'on ait développé soi-même, hein, qui ne soient pas standardisées. Les cadres légaux existants, fort basés sur le schéma des variétés homogènes, ça ne fonctionne pas du tout pour nous. Et les semences dont on a besoin ne rentrent pas dans ces critères-là et sont un peu hors cadre légal. Ce qui fait que si on prend l'initiative soi-même de développer ces semences et de les faire circuler, de les échanger, on se met très vite dans l'illégalité. Un dernier problème qu'on vit tant au nord qu'au sud, c'est l'accès à la terre, même s'il est vécu de différentes façons. Ou chez nous, au nord, c'est le prix de vente des terres qui a explosé ces dernières années à cause de différents facteurs, que ce soit des pratiques d'exploitation des terres qui soient très intensives et peu durables, qui permettent de dégager des gros profits à court terme. Ça a contribué à faire augmenter les prix, mais aussi le fait que pour beaucoup de financiers, la terre devient un placement sûr à long terme. Et donc des facteurs qui font que le prix des terres aujourd'hui est totalement déconnecté du revenu qu'on puisse en tirer.
Y nosotros pensamos que tenemos que proteger al pequeño campesinado, tenemos que proteger esta producción de pequeña escala, diversificada, orientada al mercado local, y necesitamos un marco de protección para nosotras, campesinas de Europa, para todas las campesinas y campesinos alrededor del mundo. En particular, yo soy una campesina, soy mujer y veo que muchas veces la pobreza tiene rostro de mujer campesina.
Und die Deklaration bringt
Thank you so much. I'm always very moved when I watch this video, and maybe we can post the YouTube channel in the chat for those of you who want to watch the rest of it. So as I mentioned, the framework proposed by Clifford Bob mentions 4 steps, and I want to quickly touch base and describe these 4 steps. The first one is framing, and framing is a key activity for social movements, because movements need to provide meaning for their members and the general public, and they need a powerful, resonant frame to do this. As I mentioned earlier, human rights are a powerful frame. They can bring legitimacy, they're a common language to help overcome divisions, and they also help connect to global governance debates. For peasant activists, the creation of new rights was a way to ensure that their rights claims are aligned with their visions of the world. I give the example of the right to land, which is a collective right. And it was also very clear for peasants that the right to land could not be an individual one. But other aspects of the human rights discourse of La Via Campesina are interesting too, such as the fact that rights come with responsibilities, or that the rights of the people cannot be separated from the rights of nature. The second step is externalization, which basically means that local demands have to be scaled up. The declaration, I think I mentioned, was originally drafted by local peasant organizations in the 90s in Indonesia, and it was later shared with groups in Southeast Asia. And for 6 more years, it was discussed internationally, redrafted, and finally adopted by the movement as a whole. And that is the latest draft that was then used as a basis for discussion at the UN. In the framework developed by Bob, the emphasis is placed on local actors, local communities, who really are quite disempowered unless they find the right connections with local NGOs and lawyers, who will then put them in contact with big human rights NGOs like Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch. But we have seen tremendous changes over the last 20 years, with social movements now recognized as global actors speaking for themselves, no longer relying on NGOs to speak on their behalf. They may still need some support from NGOs, but they will always maintain political control over their positions in global debates. And we see this very much at the Committee on World Food Security. In the case of the UNDROP, the link with small NGOs remained essential for 2 reasons. And you saw representatives from both FIAN and CITIM in the video. First, in some UN arenas, like the Human Rights Council, only accredited NGOs can gain access. This means that social movements can't get in. They need to be connected to an accredited NGO. And second, we shouldn't underestimate the fact that human rights issues, when they are discussed at the UN, are super technical, and that legal knowledge is central. And it's also important for social movements to work with human rights experts or NGOs who know the human rights system, because otherwise they can quickly get lost. And on this photo, you see peasant activists strategizing with their allies from FIAN and CITIM in Geneva. Step 3 of the process is convincing states. And here I want to highlight the important role played by Bolivia in this process. Bolivia, which then approached Ecuador, South Africa, and Cuba, and together they formed a core group of supportive states. Bolivia proved to be an important ally, but this also proved challenging because in 2019, the coup in Bolivia meant that it could no longer support peasants' rights in the UN processes. To put pressure on states, one of the key strategies that movements need to use is what they call inside-outside strategy, because the power of movements resides in their capacity to protest, to mobilize, to be in the streets. If they start engaging too much in institutional dialogue or advocacy, they risk losing that power. So they need to continue to put pressure on the process from the outside. And La Via Campesina was really good at doing that during the negotiations. On this photo, you can see the collective sense of victory by all the actors involved in the UNDROP process towards the end. Diplomats, lawyers, peasant activists, NGOs, researchers, even UN staff. And I want to emphasize the level of trust and personal connection within this group, as many people had been working together for years. So 3 years after the adoption of the UNDROP, the key challenge, and this is step 4, is of course implementation. I won't go into details here, but just want to point a few activities that are going on at the moment to encourage the implementation. One is, of course, the development of training and dissemination materials, like you see on the slide. It is also important to bring the instrument to the attention of states and policymakers. Second is the creation of a monitoring mechanism at the UN level, using the model of the special rapporteur, for example, or an expert group, because as I mentioned earlier, this is really important, because if there is no monitoring mechanism, it will be very difficult to document ongoing human rights violations or monitor what's going on. But this has been delayed because of the coup in Bolivia. Recently, discussions have resumed, and I'm very much hoping that this can go forward. Finally, is the importance of using UNDROP in other advocacy processes. And this is something that indigenous peoples have done really well with their declaration, pushing it and using it in any space that they would attend. In the case of peasant organizations, I anticipate that the UNDROP could be used to push for food system transformation in discussions at different levels around food security, land governance, seeds, biodiversity, climate, but also trade. But as I move into the third part of my talk, I want to mention an additional challenge, and that is pushing for a progressive interpretation of the rights contained in the UNDROP. I've insisted very much on the creation of new human rights, but that doesn't mean that the declaration is progressive on all fronts. It is the outcome of a negotiation process, the outcome of compromise. To facilitate consensus, diplomats rely on what they called agreed language when they negotiate. So what is agreed language? The term refers to existing human rights instruments or norms that states have already agreed to. So if diplomats can be convinced that what they're about to adopt is actually not new, but that it has already been adopted in another UN document, even if that document is 20, 40 years old, and even if it was developed in another context, then your task as advocate for new human rights will be much easier. I can imagine you're struggling to understand this, as basically what I'm saying is that to convince diplomats to recognize something new, you actually need to argue and show them that the rights that they're about to adopt are actually not new. And this is indeed the case. And this is exactly what we try to do, myself and a team of human rights lawyers who supported La Via Campesina in this process. So we try to dig out UN documents, both from human rights mechanisms, but also UN bodies dealing with food and agriculture, biodiversity, seeds, food security, that would basically give some legitimacy to peasant demands. For example, I spent 3 months going through all sorts of human rights documents to see if I could find anything to substantiate the need to recognize collective rights to lands and seeds. Because collective rights had become super contentious for many states, and this was clearly creating tensions and divisions in the working group, preventing the declaration from moving forward. Overall, I believe we were successful, but as I will show in the third part of my talk, in the case of gender and women's rights, we also failed. So I will now take a small break again and ask you to reflect on the role of gender in the future of food. How do you see it? And when I mean gender, I'm not only talking about women, I'm talking gender dynamics, including issues of gender identity, sexual orientation, and gender equality. So I'll leave you a few minutes so you can reflect, and then when I'll say go, I'll ask you to post your answers in the chat again. Alana and Andrea, how am I doing with time? Did we start on time, or do I need to be strict?
We did start on time. We've probably got about 10 more minutes. Is that okay, Priscilla? Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so I'll ask people to post their responses right away. Please, when you're ready. Women and girls are the most vulnerable. Driving force. Gender identities shouldn't matter. Okay, I'm waiting for more responses. Great. Fantastic. Any more responses, or people are not feeling inspired by this question? Okay, I'll just move ahead. Okay, so as you know, women, peasant women are facing an incredible number of challenges in their homes, in their farming, but also in their movements. They're the worst affected by hunger and food insecurity, as someone mentioned. They're dominated by men and patriarchal structures, which prevent them from fully participating in political life, in decision-making around food and agriculture in their territories, but also in their own organizations. They're also discriminated against when it comes to accessing land and natural resources. One area that's been increasingly acknowledged during the COVID crisis is women's contributions to unpaid care and domestic work. And what also increased, unfortunately, with the COVID crisis is the issue of domestic violence. This is something we documented in an important research that my colleague Jessica Duncan and I wrote for the CSM working group on women. And I invite you to have a look at this important report. So what have peasant women done to address these issues? And I'll mention three main ways in which they've been active: gender-based violence, political participation, and gender identity. Since the creation of La Via Campesina in 1993, peasant women have organized. They've launched a global campaign to stop violence against women, to make explicit the violence, but also its impacts. At the same time, the campaign makes evident the link between gender-based violence and capitalism and neoliberalism in agriculture. For example, as you can see in this campaign, agribusiness is a source of violence as it exposes women and their babies to chemicals. And at the same time, capitalism is a system that exploits and relies on women's exploitation in order to operate. At the heart of the campaign is something that you may have recognized as an ecofeminist approach. As you read on the slide, ecofeminist basically means that women and nature are united through a shared history of oppression. One of the key contributions of ecofeminism is to question the dualities that we have become accustomed to with modernity. And it shows that basically one half depends on the other half to thrive, and that one half is exploited for the other half to enjoy privileges. What ecofeminists argue then is the need to move away from an ego-logical approach to an ecological approach that is more circular, horizontal, and interdependent. And these are some newspaper clips articulating this link between women and nature and the environment. The second issue that women have worked on is the issue of political participation, and they've implemented gender quotas in all their executive bodies to ensure that both men and women could participate equally. The movement has also put in place safe spaces for women. For example, before international events, women will meet in a women-only space for a few days to discuss their challenges and approaches. You see here images from the last Women's Assembly in Bilbao in 2018. And at this last assembly, they launched the concept of popular peasant feminism, which is emerging in the movement. I also want to highlight efforts in the last 3 to 4 years to address systemic discrimination in the countryside towards people with diverse gender identities. This is only emerging in the movement, but I think it deserves more attention. So I want to look here quickly at some of the demands that have been articulated by women and reflect on how well they've been integrated in the UNDROP. And this is the outcome of a research collaboration with Joanna Burg-Martignoni. Before I do that, I have to go run and get my charger because unfortunately I see that my laptop is about to die. My apologies.
While we're waiting, a really good opportunity to think of your questions for Priscilla, and you're very welcome to put them in the chat and or raise a hand when we all join together. We just had a little song, so we're fine.
Okay. So basically, the point we made in this paper that we recently finished is to say that there's a number of demands that just didn't make it into the declaration. And we try and analyze why that was the case. Because, for example, issues around violence, capitalism, ecofeminism, patriarchy didn't really make it into the declaration. And one key thing that is missing is a recognition of women's rights to inherit land. And so in the paper, we try and understand what happened and identify 3 pressure points. So I'll just summarize them here. The first one has to do with the fact that, as I mentioned, the draft declaration that served as a basis for discussion really emphasized and defended the family farm. And despite discussions within the movement, we have a sense that this draft was very much driven by the Asian region, while feminist claims were stronger in the Latin American region. And some of feminist claims didn't make it into the draft, which really had a very binary understanding of women and men and didn't make visible power relations within the farm. A second challenge and a pressure point that we identified was when peasant claims, feminist claims had to be translated into agreed language. If you remember what I explained around agreed language, you'll see that here also we had to find UN texts to defend these feminist claims. And the only document we could really refer to was the International Covenant on the non-discrimination against women, on the elimination of discrimination against women. And this is a rather old document that is an important framework, but that is not super progressive either. And finally, there were a number of states opposing quite an important number of provisions around gender equality, such as women's rights to inherit land, issues of gender identity and sexual orientation. And because Bolivia really needed to have an important number of states voting in favor of the declaration, it had to make the pragmatic decision to eliminate these provisions so that the declaration could be adopted. I believe that all is not lost. Feminist groups are pushing now for a feminist interpretation of the UNDRAP and pushing for links between food sovereignty and feminism. And I personally have also a research project that we started in Africa looking at women's rights to communal land, building on the importance of collective rights in the UNDRAP, but looking at how collective rights shouldn't mean that women's rights are forgotten about. So as we enter the last part of this talk, and this will be a very short conclusion, I want to have you reflect very shortly on the role of academics in the future of food. See if you can think of some responses to post in the chat. But because I'm running out of time, I'll just continue with my talk. For this last part of my talk, I want to pay tribute to attorney Ben Ramos, a Filipino people's lawyer who dedicated his life to defending the rights of small farmers to their land. I met Ben when I was 26 and I wasn't sure what I was going to do with my life. And his passion and vision of the world certainly shaped my commitment to peasants' rights. And Ben was killed 3 years ago because he was working on an important case. I also want to acknowledge my research collaboration with Jessica Duncan, who's my intellectual companion, and we've discussed issues around scholar activism quite a bit. We run a blog together that you can also have a look at. So I just want to highlight that scholar activism is a very old concept. It has always existed, but despite this history, it's still very marginalized and contested. What does it mean, scholar activism? It basically means that as a scholar, you want to contribute to social change. You have some kind of link to marginalized groups or cause, that you're committed to producing knowledge that is relevant to a movement or a struggle, and that you engage in horizontal dialogues with research participants so that you can ensure that the research that you do is actually relevant and useful to them, and they can participate in creating it. Over the years, I've come to see that as a scholar activist, you can get to play many different roles in a movement. Facilitate a meeting, translate, take notes, direct financial and human resources, provide technical expertise, as I did here for the UNDRAP, but also participate in protests. This is a protest within FAO with FIAN, Right to Food Friends. Scholar activists comes with great challenges. The timeframes are different. Activists need to move quickly, while academics tend to be very slow. Power relations need to be taken into account. But despite these challenges, I think we have a role to play. As I mentioned in the introduction, the Food Systems Summit will be taking place next week. On this photo, you can see the special summit, special envoy, Agnes Kalibata, as well as some of the rhetoric the summit has been using around inclusivity, participation, human rights, people solutions. Peasant movements have criticized the summit for a number of reasons. The summit, in their opinion, is not transparent. It is not grounded in human rights, despite its discourse. They've also complained that the summit co-opts their solutions. And you will see in many of the documents allusions to agroecology, resilience, indigenous knowledge, while really what social movements think is that actors in the Global Food Summit are pushing for digitalization, financialization, technology-driven solutions. And fourth, they have criticized the fact that the Food Systems Summit relies on a narrow view of science. Finally, and what has really mobilized peasants and other actors to mobilize against the summit is their feeling that the summit is under corporate influence. It is dominated by corporate interests, philanthropic foundations, and very close links between these actors. In their view, the summit undermines existing democratic governance, especially the Committee on World Food Security and the mechanisms that are in place to facilitate the participation of those most affected by global hunger and food insecurity. So to conclude, I want to bring to the fore some of the key words that I try to unpack in my talk, and these are heavy words. Colonialism, capitalism, patriarchy, resistance. And I want to offer some takeaway messages that I hope will keep you warm and inspired. First, peasants are the future. They are part of the solution. Their voices must be heard in discussions on food system transformation. Second, human rights are an important resistance tool. They are not static. They respond to new threats and new forms of oppression. And if you want to become involved, check out organizations like FIAN to defend the right to food, or work closely with peasant organizations in your area. Third, social change won't happen if we don't address patriarchy. We can all take a stance against power relations, and I believe men can be feminists too. We can take a stance in our home, in the food system, and in academia, where I find that a lot of machismo still prevails. Finally, academics have a key role to play. Our food systems are facing many challenges, and it's our responsibility to document these and also put solutions on the table. Those of us who feel like they want to make a difference and fight injustice can really do so. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to your questions and our debate.
Priscilla, thank you so much. Please, everyone join me in giving Priscilla a huge hand wherever you are. And it would be really lovely if people could even put their screens on if they're able to, so we can see some faces for the Q&A. Priscilla, it was such an amazing, engaging and inclusive talk, and I just admire you so much for explaining that complexity in a very accessible way. I think that a lot of us working in the food area need to understand some of those, the importance of those legal frameworks, and as communicators, what you're talking about in terms of amplifying the voices of the people who are actually most affected by the issues. And this can be, you know, obviously very, very challenging, but you did a great job of describing how this common frame of food sovereignty actually does also cross borders, countries, hemispheres, and it affects so many people around the world. So who would like to ask Priscilla a question?
I'm just going to get my notes. Okay, maybe I can just do it like that. Okay, we're still.
You can raise your hand. That's wonderful. And I can't see any hands yet. Lots of compliments. A great motivational talk. Romana, are you clapping or are you raising a hand? I think you should ask a question as well. Oh, here we go. Great question from Laura. Thank you for a great and moving presentation. A question about more about the role of the scholar activists. In many of the communities academics research, there's potential for mobilization, self-advocacy, change-making, etc. But I often worry that in aiding or participating this, we might put members of that community, particularly women, in danger, which is a really, really good question. So how do we balance that and also provide support and get support?
Well, my answer would be to put research participants in the driving seat, because they will be able to tell you, you know, what they need in terms of research support or research questions that they would like you to explore, or if you need to get involved with the media or in advocacy, but they will be able to know their context and tell you, you know, if it's relevant or not. And actually to change hat now and talk about my FIAN hat, we have a policy not to get involved unless people or communities explicitly request our intervention. And before, releasing a press release or a report, we always check with the communities first to make sure that this won't happen at their expense. So I think just being in dialogue with research participants, avoiding extractivism. A lot of us tend to just go in, get some information, leave the field, and that just never return anything or never be in contact with these people again. So I think ensuring that they also get something out of your research, that you go back and validate what you've done, that they can review your interpretation, but also get engaged in what you do with the research results.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, excellent. Thank you. Again, the letting people lead the way. Does anyone have a question? I've got one. I'm dying to ask a question. I could talk to you for about 5 hours, Priscilla, but I was restricted to one question. I always have this conversation with people about food sovereignty, and they understand it in a rural context. And increasingly, people are starting to talk about what is the relevance, given that many of us live in cities. How do we actually communicate food sovereignty? What does it mean for people who live in urban environments? And has there been much progress made in articulating that by the movements?
Yeah, I think there's increasing articulation. Maybe 3 things I can respond to that. First, I think the basic understanding of food sovereignty is the right to, I didn't mention that, but it's the right to participate in decisions and discussions around food and agriculture. And I think this is true for not only rural people, but people who live in cities. And I think when we see the development of food policy councils at local level, what's going on in your municipality, I think this is about the right of every citizen to get engaged in discussions on what food you get to eat, what food you get access to. So I think food sovereignty is certainly not conceived as a project exclusively for rural people. It really has the vocation of providing this alternative model for everyone. Second, we had, of course, many discussions when we were defining the term peasants in the context of the declaration. And actually, people who are aspiring to produce food or become farmers are also included under the umbrella definition. So this covers urban agriculture, but also people who are moving into farming, who should also be able to access land, for example, which I think is also super important.
Excellent.
Yeah. I see another question.
That's great. And someone relatedly, this is a good question. What can consumers do to support peasants and food sovereignty?
Well, as I mentioned, I think an immediate step is, of course, to join community-supported agriculture schemes and get in touch with peasants in your area, trained by locals. Some of you mentioned that at the beginning. But I think just being aware of the issues, being advocates for peasants' rights, participating in urgent actions or, petitions, just being active and supportive of these issues is, I think, also super important.
Thank you. Wonderful. Now we'll move over to Juliana for her question. Just unmute yourself and we'll...
Oh, sorry. Hi. Okay. Good morning. Thank you so much for this. I'm not an expert of patriarchy, and I really like your talk. I'm more of a media and journalism person, academic. I'm thinking about patriarchy. I'm very intrigued. From my personal experience, the problem that I have with a dominant male environment is patriarchy, but it's also what happens when we are successful in weakening patriarchy. Because when we are successful, women are left alone to solve problems and find solutions. So this is my main thought. I wonder if you can say something more about that. What does it mean that we have to fight against patriarchy in the context of your talk? You mentioned this, especially towards the end. But what does it mean then in practice? For example, for us, I live in an urban place, and what does it mean in practical terms?
Well, I think that's a huge question. I won't be able to get into that in 13 minutes. What did you mean with women would be left alone? I think women are doing most of the job anyways.
Yeah, that's the point. So, in a way, how do you bring men men to the same level and working together in a non-patriarchal way? Because I don't think I can do all the job. Again, that's why I started by saying I'm not talking as an expert, but as a woman who is sometimes trying to solve a lot of problems about, my own food management, for example.
Right. I mean, at the personal level, I think that this is quite personal, but what we try and do, for example, in the framework of this Africa project that I mentioned, which is really led by women peasant organizations, we also try and have discussions with the men, right? So it's not only, I think we have to fight this idea that women's rights are a women's issue. I think so just engaging men in these discussions, right? That they also are, I think, suffering from this situation in many ways, right? They can't show their emotions at a very early age. They're like suppressed in like many parts of their personality. So I think just trying to show them how they could benefit also from the abolishment of patriarchy and trying to get them engaged in these discussions. But it's a very complex problem and many are not interested. And often when you have these discussions or you go to conference around gender issues, it's mostly women in the room. So yeah, I think it's a major communication issue and they feel threatened very often. So yeah, I agree. It's not easy to address. Yeah, there's more questions in the chat.
Yes, Siobhan, would you like to ask your question, Siobhan?
Sure. Sorry, it's one of those awkward questions, but I'm a PhD student and I'm just kind of interested in your journey and what you've learned. And so where you are now, what would you say to your younger self? What are the things that you've learned that you would maybe do differently, you would do again? So that's sort of question.
Are you in that position where you're also wearing multiple hats or?
No. Oh, well, yes and no. I want to. I work in the English department, so I feel like my work doesn't translate like yours does to immediate, but I wanted to.
Right.
And so I guess, yeah, when I'm studying literature, like references for food and literature, there is so much there. And it's like, well, okay, this is really interesting, and I'm learning a lot and I'm being changed by what I'm learning. But how does the rubber hit the road?
Right. What would I say to the younger self? I think I had intuitions very early on in my life, but somehow it took me some time to follow these intuitions. And so I would say just be fearless. Just try and connect to your intuition and try and link to people who you feel are sharing. I think creating these spaces, especially these women's spaces, often can be very important. For example, in my department, I think that has changed us a lot. We've created a women's WhatsApp group. We've created a women's space where we go, we're even now talking about creating a menopause group at our center. Just to have these spaces where you can truly be yourself and not feel like you have to play all these roles. I think is what I would say. Yeah.
Thank you.
And the wonderful thing about studying food, Siobhan, is it's so interdisciplinary. So don't let anyone tell you that you can't talk about food because you're in the English department.
Right. Absolutely.
A question from Tanya. Tanya, did you want to ask your question or will I read it out for you? It's about the middleman. This is a really good question. Yeah, what's the role of the food brokers like the supermarkets and the grocers in terms of this, getting this balance right between food production?
Well, that's a tricky question. I'll start by saying middleman or middlewoman, just to get the point across. But no, it's a very good question and very tricky, and it's very debated. I think on the one hand, intermediaries capture most of the money in the supply chain, and that's very problematic. If you look at what you pay for a box of cereal and what a peasant actually gets out of that for selling his grain, I think there's a huge injustice there. So I think cutting down intermediaries and ensuring that that more of the value will go to the people actually doing the work is super important. But I think in some cases there are real issues with accessing markets, and intermediaries are important. So for me, it's really about how do you organize that? It's a logistical questions as well. And it's a question of addressing power imbalances in the supply chain. So I'm working now on a food belt project here in the south of Belgium. And it's just, we organize dialogues between consumers, organic shops, producers for days, just trying to establish a fair price, for example. Farmers will offer a certain price, and then organic shops have to say, well, if I sell at that price, I won't be able to sell. And then we just, try and reflect on what is a fair price. And I think these are really important debates, and just making visible what labor goes into food and who earns what. Yeah.
Absolutely. Carolyn Steele was saying that last night about that whole value chain approach and the way you need to look at it very holistically. That's great. Now, Romana has a question about language at the UN, which, as you highlighted, is a real challenge. Agreed language is part of the problem. How can rigid UN structures be made more flexible and open? Maybe you might talk about the CSM a bit. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think the agreed language issue is very specific to the Human Rights Council, because it's really led by diplomats. As I mentioned, there has been a level of participation of civil society actors, but this participation is not embedded in the Human Rights Council. We have other bodies like the Committee on World Food Security, where really we have mechanisms in place to facilitate participation of those affected, and there you have much more flexible and open approaches. But I think even in negotiations at the Committee on World Food Security, it's always easier to convince states where you can build on existing documents and norms. So I think it's a matter of building gradually and creating shifts. And also creating progressive interpretations at national and other levels, so that gradually you can create new understandings or interpretations of existing norms. Yeah, but it's a very good question.
It is. And a question from Matea.
Yeah, apologies. I should explain it because I'm not sure I understand it from the chat. Would you explain it?
Yeah, Matea, are you there? Would you like to speak to it?
Yes. So I was wondering, because there is a transnational context very strong, and what about the national level? How is it reflected there, please?
Okay. Yeah, so of course I focused on the global level, but for example, La Via Campesina is also active at European level. So they have what is called the European Coordination of Via Campesina. You can check their website. It's called ECVC. And of course, their main target has been the Common Agricultural Policy reform, because that has a huge impact on what is possible, what isn't possible. They're also trying to get active on the new European Green Deal and the farm to fork strategy. And actually with a group of scholar activists in Europe, we have released an analysis of the farm to fork strategy of the EU, because that's going to be really influencing food policy in the next decade, and just analyzing it from a food sovereignty perspective and showing its limitations, because there's loads of contradictions in the farm to fork strategy, a lot of good things on which we can build on, but also very much, again, an agenda geared towards digitalization, big data, innovations. And that's really what we are hearing today, right? So an analysis of farm to fork. Yeah, if you have a look, so I mentioned our blog, globalgovernance.com, foodgovernance.com, sorry, the blog that we run with Jessica Duncan. There you can find the analysis of the farm to fork. And it was actually translated in many European languages because it was built by a network of European scholars. So you can find it there. So it's foodgovernance.com.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, I send it to
Wonderful. Now we have 3 minutes. Does anyone have one last question for Priscilla? Well, it's been such an amazing session, and I know I speak for everybody when I thank you for your generosity and your time and your passion and all the work that you're doing. It was so lovely to see so many people in your slides, and I think that that really, you know, it sums up what your work is about, really, people and that connection to the land. And I think that we should all be following La Via Campesina's achievements, and it's truly amazing that more than 20 years on, that social movement is going strong, and it's such a credible and important part of the political food scene, and it's gives us hope. But meanwhile, everybody needs to get behind the alternative food summit. So when you see lots of the social media about the UN Food Systems Summit, just remember and explain to everybody you know that that is not the authentic democratic body that we need to solve a lot of these problems. So Priscilla, would you like to make a last comment? Or
No, I think that was great. You can also check on our. I can try and find it. We also did a small video to explain the problem with multi-stakeholderism in the context of the summit, because I think that's been one of the key issues. It has been so good at communicating that it is inclusive, participatory, that even for governments, it's been hard to understand what's wrong with the summit. And so we put out this, if you type a UN Food System Summit and multi-stakeholderism, it's a very short 3-minute video, but it really explained what's wrong with the approach to participation that the summit has been following. You know, just holding a lot of dialogues, but then it's totally unclear who's going to do what, who's going to be accountable, and how to make sure that there is no corporate capture of our food system. So I think
excellent.
I really encourage you to follow that next week.
Wonderful. And I think academics can still sign up, supporting the peasant movements. Please join me, everyone, in thanking Priscilla.
Thank you so much.
It's been an absolute pleasure. So I think that, well, I should hand over to Andrea.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Priscilla. It was really amazing, an amazing session. I think we all learned so many new things because being mostly like food and communication scholars, this perspective is of course very, important to us to